Hello everybody, and welcome back to Microsoft Flight School. This episode, we're going to be pivoting to something slightly less heady than last episode, but it's still really important that you at least watch that one, as the concepts that will be shown off in this one are going to be leaning heavily on what we covered in episode 1. So today we're discussing turns, and I'm a bit at odds with how to begin this one, because how this episode goes depends on what I think you might assume about how an airplane turns. My initial assumption, prior to going back and doing some research on this, is that if you took somebody who had never controlled an aircraft before and placed them in a cockpit mid-flight and said, turn right, they would panic, probably, but then when they came to, they would in all likelihood grab the yoke and turn it to the right, since out of all of the undecipherable garbage you're subjected to in a cockpit, the yoke is the closest facsimile to a steering wheel in a car or on a boat if you're a sea captain. But then I went to go reference our friend Mr. Langewiesche for this episode, and in his chapter on turns, which is surprisingly long and kind of mean, he spends a decent amount of time in the first part of the chapter dispelling what I guess was a pretty common assumption that you turn an airplane mostly using the rudder, which is controlled by the foot pedals on the floor. Now, maybe this was a more common belief back in the 30s and 40s, but I'm not so sure that's the case anymore. People now generally have a higher degree of familiarity with both cars and planes, so while I'm still going to go through my explanation of turns using a lot of the cooler concepts Langewiesche goes over in his chapter, I'm still sticking with my original assumption that you would all instinctively use the yoke to turn primarily over the rudders. So again, assuming you've all correctly guessed how to initiate a turn in an airplane, I'm going to spend this episode mostly explaining two things. What is actually causing the airplane to turn once you've inputted the proper controls, and once you understand all the moving pieces of a turn, how to turn correctly or at least better, and also dispel some myths that may or may not still be out there. Okay, so let's show off a few things first. They're called primary control surfaces, and you're going to need to know what all three do because they are all used more or less in equilibrium while performing a turn. Remember, these surfaces are planes. They're simply redirecting air to maneuver the aircraft. You're probably already familiar with some of them, but let's start with the ailerons. They're controlled, as I mentioned earlier, by taking the yoke and moving it left and right. Now, what this actually does is just controls these little flaps on the edges of the wingtip. This redirects air up on one side and down on the other, and vice versa, causing the aircraft to roll, or more technically, move along its longitudinal axis. Next up is the elevator, aptly named as it moves the aircraft up and down. It's controlled by taking that same yoke and pushing it in or pulling it out, and it actually controls this surface on the back of the tail. It allows the airplane to pitch or move along its lateral axis. And last is the rudder, which we spoke about earlier as well. It's controlled by these foot pedals on the floorboards of the cockpit, and it actually controls this piece that runs along the trailing edge of the vertical stabilizer. The motion that using the rudder causes, as well as the name of the axis that allows the aircraft to move along, are both called yaw, Y-A-W, the etymology of which is still uncertain. But anyway, that's all the vocab that you'll need for today's lesson, so let's get up there and start turning. Okay, so we're finally back up in the air, and you need to make a right turn. So you take the yoke, turn it to the right until you've made a bank of about 20 degrees, then you let go to stop the roll here, and you begin to turn right. What is happening? Well, Langewiesche goes about describing a turn in what he calls an exploded view, explaining each piece of motion as if it were happening in a vacuum. Since we did that with the control surfaces, I'm going to do the same thing here. So let's start off with the wings. The wings are providing much of the lift of the aircraft, and if you remember from last episode, that really just means that it is pushing air down. Now that we're at an angle, two things are happening. The wings are now pushing less air down, but are now pushing some of that air to the left. Now, this alone wouldn't cause the airplane to turn, and Langewiesche claims that without the tail or the vertical stabilizer, a banked aircraft would just fly straight. I have no way of demonstrating this, so let's just move on to those parts. And we'll start with the vertical stabilizer. Normally, when you're flying straight, the vertical stabilizer just acts to keep the plane straight. But now that we're banked, it helps to complete the turn, so to speak. Now that it's on its side a little bit, it is pushing some air down, which in turn swings the nose around or into the turn. And that leaves us with the tail, the horizontal stabilizer, and the elevator. You may be thinking that if the wings are now generating less downward deflection in exchange for sideways deflection, that the airplane would start to sink, and you would be exactly right. In order to maintain the same altitude during a turn, you actually do have to pull back on the stick a little bit just to compensate for some of the lost lift from having the wings banked. And so that's it. That's the exploded view of a turn. 3 different control surfaces working in concert to steer the ship. Just like everything else I'm going to be showing off in this series, turning is going to require some practice and some trial and error. But before we go, I am going to show off some other stuff. First, I want to show you what happens when you try and turn using a rudder, because according to Langewiesche, this was a pretty common thing to do, or at least to think, back in the 30s and 40s, and it's just awful. When you initiate a turn with a rudder, a couple of things happen. Firstly, you're moving the back of the plane first, which causes the airplane to do more like a skid or like a drift, if you'd like. What happens next is that the relative wind that you've got built up will start to push the outside wings skyward. As this happens, the vertical stabilizer becomes more horizontal, and since you're still pushing down on the rudder, you are both pushing the nose down and forcing the roll to become more extreme. You can counteract this a little bit by turning the yoke away from the turn, but you're still slipping into the turn rather than turning directly. It's just bad all around. Don't do this. This isn't to say that you shouldn't touch the rudder at all during a turn. You can if you initiate the turn correctly using the yoke. Use the rudder a little bit to guide the nose further into the turn or slightly away from the turn. This should really only be used during like choppy weather because, as you can see, you can have a pretty smooth turn without actually using it. And lastly, I just want to reiterate how important it is to use the elevator to maintain altitude during a turn. As I mentioned earlier, when you initiate the roll, you do lose some lift. Depending on what type of aircraft it is, how steep the bank is, what the weather is, what your altitude was initially, the amount of altitude you can lose varies greatly. You will, in all likelihood, recover some of that altitude based on the speed that you gain from the dive, but really, there's just far too much variability. Please don't get into the habit of doing this. Get into the habit of adjusting the elevator during turns to maintain the altitude throughout, or you're going to crash into a hillside. And so I think that that's a good place to stop for this lesson. Hope this helps guide you on what you should be practicing and what you should be avoiding. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.